Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast. Good morning. It's Monday, the 29th of December. I'm Stephen Carroll in London. Coming up today, Donald Trump holds face-to-face talks with Volodymyr Zelenskiy as sticking points remain in the Ukraine peace plan. Global stocks continue their rise, with precious metals and copper joining the end-of-year rally. Plus, a stern warning: China kicks off military drills around Taiwan following a US arms deal. Let's start with a roundup of our top stories. A Russia-Ukraine peace deal is closer than ever, according to the US president. Donald Trump made the pronouncement after hosting his Ukrainian counterpart, Volodymyr Zelenskiy, for talks in Florida. Speaking after the meeting, Trump offered an upbeat assessment of a possible peace deal, but said it may take a few weeks to finalise.
I really believe we're probably, Mr. President, by far closer than ever before with both parties. We had some times when he was close and President Putin wasn't. Then when President Putin was close and he wasn't. You saw that in the White House. But I think they both want to see it happen.
President Trump there speaking as Volodymyr Zelenskiy said the peace framework is 90% agreed and that US-Ukraine security guarantees are 100% agreed, but that key issues relating to territory remain unresolved. The US President says he's now aiming to convene a meeting with Zelensky and European leaders in January. Global stocks have risen to yet another record high as a much-expected year-end rally took hold. The MSCI All Country World Index steady in Asia after climbing by 1.4% last week as the tech sector led the gains. The moves in the stock market came as silver gyrated after smashing through $80 an ounce for the first time, powered by speculative trades and a persistent mismatch between supply and demand. It's currently trading just slightly below that level. Meanwhile, copper has also surged towards a record $13,000 a tonne on the London Metal Exchange in a stunning end-of-year rally fuelled by concerns over tighter supply. Gains topped 15% in December as investors bet that a rush to get metal to the US ahead of a possible import tariff will force buyers elsewhere to pay more. In the UK, opposition parties are calling for a British Egyptian democracy activist, Alaa Abdel Fattah, to be deported after it emerged that he had posted social media messages over a decade ago calling for Zionists to be killed. Fattah returned to the UK on Friday after being detained for 6 years in Egypt on charges of spreading false news. He was pardoned after years of lobbying by Conservative and Labour governments. Tory leader Kemi Badenoch and Reform UK's Nigel Farage have called for the Home Secretary to look into whether the Egyptian dissident can be stripped of his UK citizenship and deported. In a statement, Fattah has apologised for the posts, some of which he said had been completely twisted out of their meaning. A former EU official hit with a US visa ban has called on the bloc to fight back. Thierry Breton says the EU should resist US attempts to influence its legislation aimed at regulating social media. Speaking on France's TF1 television, Breton said counteraction is needed.
They cannot force us to change laws that we voted for democratically, just to please who? To please the US social media platforms? No, we must stand up, we must resist.
That was former EU digital chief Thierry Breton speaking on French television yesterday. Recently, the US administration imposed visa bans on Breton as well as several activists, describing their attempts to fight online hate speech as censorship aimed at American tech companies. Breton went on to say that he has received widespread political backing following the US visa ban announcement. Bank of America's CEO expects the Trump administration to de-escalate trade tensions next year after tariff-related shocks in 2025. Speaking to CBS News, Brian Moynihan says he expects an average of 15% tariffs for the broad base of countries with higher rates for those that won't commit to lowering non-tariff barriers.
You're starting to see the resolution of the discussions into 15% here, 17, different numbers. When you put China's a different question because of national security interests, the rare earth minerals, the magnets, batteries, just the AI, all that stuff. It's a very different case.
Bank of America's Brian Moynihan speaking there to CBS's Face the Nation. In April, Trump announced a baseline rate of 10% tariffs on all imports into the US. Bloomberg Economics estimates that the average US tariff rate rose to 14% from 2% after Trump returned to the White House. And China has begun military drills around Taiwan following a US deal to sell the island arms worth up to $11 billion. The operation underscores how sensitive the Taiwan question is to Beijing. According to a statement from the Chinese military, the exercises will include live fire drills and involve all major branches of the military. The manoeuvres follow the decision on Friday to unveil largely symbolic sanctions against 20 US defence companies and 10 executives. And those are your top stories. In a moment, we'll bring you the latest on the Ukraine peace talks, plus what's driven the price of silver to a record high. But another story that we've been reading this morning on how AI is affecting not only the work that we're doing, but the games that we're playing as well. Now, Kit Chilel has written a great essay about this. He looks at how technology has been encroaching on our leisure activities, writing that software has matched or surpassed us in virtually any activity involving cards, boards, or dice. And even if you've bet on horse races or done fantasy sports, you've probably competed against artificial intelligence without realising it. Nothing is safe. Kit even managed to find researchers teaching neural networks to play the board game Catan. So there are questions, of course, about what this means for the human experience of game playing as well. Kit spoke to the philosopher Susan Schneider about this. She talked about her worries about so-called intellectual levelling. So what if large language models end up steering us all towards the same TV shows, the same destinations, the same games, while telling all of us that it's just for you? This kind of flattening, Kit says, is already happening in poker. He's been writing a book about that in particular. But can games still be fun if machines are involved? Does it take away the key element of competition and what makes it challenging? Some food for thought as we're coming towards the end of this year, where, of course, so much of the conversation has been dominated by how AI is changing the world we live in. We'll find that piece on Bloomberg.com. We'll put a link to it in our podcast show notes as well. Let's bring you more now, though, on the talks between the US and Ukrainian leaders in Florida. Donald Trump says a lot of progress was made. We'll get the details now with our Chief Asia correspondent, Rosalind Matheson, who's been following this story for us. Ros, good morning. Volodymyr Zelenskiy talked about several areas being 100% agreed after these talks. What do we know about where progress was made?
Well, in terms of where progress was made, it was mainly things around security guarantees, according to the Ukrainian leader. At least that those are agreed. US-Ukraine security guarantees, that is, the US President Donald Trump also talked about that. On the question of US-Europe-Ukraine security guarantees, Zelensky said these were almost agreed, and that's where Europe will have a big role in assuring the future security of Ukraine. And that's something that Donald Trump has been insisting on. He also talked about progress around the role of the military. That probably includes the size of the Ukrainian military after the war and continued military support for Ukraine. It also, is understandings around Ukraine's economy, and that includes trade arrangements with the US, in essence, how to ensure that US gets some kind of economic benefit from the support it's given Ukraine. So there seems to have been progress in all those areas. Certainly the conversations between Zelensky and Donald Trump seem to be much warmer than they were at least a year ago, and that there is progress there, but a lot of other areas and really key areas where progress has not been made.
Yeah, indeed, such a change since that particular White House meeting that we can all remember between the presidents as well. Let's talk about the sticking points then. Where do we see the parties furthest apart on this plan?
Well, the biggest area is obviously land, and that's this question of territory. And Russia obviously wants Ukraine to cede territory that's still held by Ukraine in the Donbass region. That's territory that Russia has failed to take and hold in the years that this war has gone on. Ukraine is obviously refusing that, and territory really is the fundamental issue here for Ukraine. Zelensky's talked about a potential demilitarized zone in that area of the Donbass as long as Russia pulls back its forces, but that's something Moscow is unlikely to agree to. So fundamental questions around land. There's also a question around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is occupied at the moment by Russia. Ukraine wants to share ownership of that plant with the US. there's possible that it could be joint ownership split three ways, including Russia, the US, and Ukraine, although very unwieldy as a result. So questions around land, who controls what, and Ukraine still wanting a sense in the end of what happens if Russia were to attack again. What kind of guarantees really in all of this? How binding are they particularly? And that's where Donald Trump has prevaricated a bit, is how binding would all of this be? So still quite a few very significant sticking points there.
And of course, these are talks that were happening between the US and Ukraine. How acceptable is any of this likely to be to Russia?
Well, Donald Trump's been doing a bit of a double track here where he's been talking to the Russian leader and then separately talking to the Ukrainian leader. He does talk about possibly still trying to get them together at some point. So he's doing a dance between these two sides. And obviously for Russia, there are questions around territory. There are also questions around the size of Ukraine's army after the war. Russia wants guarantees against future eastward expansion by NATO. That's the military alliance. They want guarantees on Ukraine's neutral status if it joins the European Union. So there are still things here that Russia says that they want. And we see these agreements edging a little bit one way, then Russia says, hang on, that's too far in favour of Ukraine. And then Ukraine says, hang on, these are too far in favour, obviously, of Russia. And so we're still in that area where Trump is negotiating separately with each leader, but you're not getting any real negotiation still between Russia and Ukraine directly.
And on that point then, how much closer or how far away does an end to the war look like after what we've seen this ramping up of diplomatic activity in recent weeks?
That's right. We have seen a ramp up in diplomatic activity. We're also seeing fighting going on still on the ground. We're seeing energy, strikes on energy facilities, shipping facilities. On the weekend, Moscow launched a very large airstrike on Kiev and on energy facilities. And Vladimir Putin has refused Donald Trump's calls for a truce. He's saying we have to have an agreement first before there's any truce. So the fighting goes on. And Donald Trump himself, he says after all these conversations on the weekend, it might take weeks. There's no set timeline. He's been very careful to move away from specific dates. He used to sort of claim that he would get this war done very quickly, and obviously it's a year on and he hasn't. So now he's talking in general terms about weeks. The question is, does he have a follow-up conversation with the Russian leader today? What does that call achieve, if anything? Is there potentially a meeting between the US, Europe and Ukraine in January? Does that propel things forward? But there's no set timeline here and no great sense, again, that they're making much progress on these fundamental issues around land. So for now, at least, no end to the war is in sight.
OK, Ros Mattson, our Chief Asia correspondent, thank you very much for joining us. Stay with us. More from Bloomberg Daybreak Europe coming up after this. On the markets now, the price of silver hit a record high this morning after a blistering run for precious metals this year. Our executive editor for Asian markets, Paul Dobson, joins us now for more. Paul, starting then with silver, bit of a wild ride going on. Every time I look at the price, it's moved pretty significantly. What's driving the rally that we're seeing today and over the past number of days?
Yeah, hi there. Good morning, Stephen. As you say, very volatile market conditions for precious metals and silver in particular. We've really had a big burst higher at the open in Asia today. I think the things that are behind the move are, one, quite a lot of hype. Precious metals tend to attract a lot of retail investment interest, which can be very much want to jump on the trend mentality. So there's definitely quite a lot of speculative bets, people piling into ETFs and betting that the price will just continue to ramp up. But behind that, there's this underlying picture of an imbalance in supply and demand. We've seen central bank buying throughout the year, use of silver in industrial processes, which makes it stand out a little bit differently to gold as well, particularly in solar power equipment, and people looking forwards to the prospect of more interest rate cuts from central banks after the three that we've seen in reasonably quick succession from the Fed at the end of this year, making people more confident in precious metals which don't carry a yield relative to hard currency, which of course does carry some sort of interest rate on deposits.
So thinking about that then going into next year, is that a trade that's likely to continue in that direction? What's the outlook then for these precious metals in 2026?
It certainly feels like the bulls are outnumbering the bears at the moment. Now, that might make you feel potentially that this is a one-sided trade and that the rug could get pulled from under the feet of investors and cause some quite nasty corrections along the way, which, we sort of saw in a microcosmic way intraday today with the silver move. But there's definitely consensus on higher prices, provided that central bank demand continues, particularly from the likes of China and emerging markets. So Goldman Sachs, for example, has gold pegged at 4,900 or more going into 2026, but there are plenty of calls for $5,000 and even higher than that. We've had that narrative as well this year about the debasement trade, the idea that people don't want any traditional currency. They would rather hold something physical in their hands, gold, silver, platinum, whatever they can do. And that does become something of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If people are worried that the price is going to go higher, they'll want to jump in and buy it now rather than wait until later. So, it's quite possible that at some point we reach much higher levels, but it's also certain that as we get quite thin liquidity at these stretched levels, we're going to see much more volatility and rapid corrections backwards, as well as the rally or that underlying sentiment offering some sort of support.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.